Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to give you a little bit of a different view, and I'm going to begin with a simple statement. This is the statement. People are the new software of cybersecurity. They're your front line. Without them, all of the policies and procedures and strategies fold like a house of cards. Okay? I think that's really important to think about. So investing in your people, now the first thing you're probably thinking about is training, right? Let's just train them. What do you guys think the problem is with training when it comes to behavior that we're trying to encourage? What does training look like? You don't know. Well, that's even scarier if there's no training. I mean, it's sort of like, well, we're going to put this in place and hopefully the people will, do what they're supposed to do. Does anyone include training in their services or training in-house? Or include a module in what to do in case of a breach or to prevent a breach in your organization? So?
It's a classroom thing that happens once a year, and it's a binder.
That's it. That's where I was going. It's very informational, and I'll tell you, my background's in behavioral science. I studied organizational psychology at Columbia University. I also then studied adult learning, and adults learn differently, right? So when you listen to PowerPoints, a lot of times the retention level is very poor, right? You kind of forget immediately, unless you make it personal, unless it's transformative, and you experience something disorienting, so disorienting that you don't ever forget how to respond. And as the previous speakers have talked about, response time is everything, right? Reputation is super important. So what is needed nowadays, in addition to the scaffolding, is recoding the software of your people, okay? And I'm going to show you why that's super duper important, and not just a little slogan that I just made up 2 minutes ago, all right? So when you train people, let's talk about people for a second. Just think about all the slides you just saw. That's a lot of information. And for some chief information officer or somebody else to translate that into just, common parlance, holy moly, that's breathtaking, right? So we know it's super important, but how do we translate that? So people operate consciously and subconsciously, right? So the thing that truly drives people's behavior is not conscious. We think consciously, but the values that we use that manifest in behaviors come from this place. When I say subconscious, what do you think I mean?
Just kind of natural reaction.
Natural reaction. It's your gut reaction. And it's not a funny thing at all, but I thought it was kind of interesting because for years, I grew up in New York and New Jersey, the tri-state area, and for years when you're watching TV, it would get interrupted by the emergency broadcast system. You know which one I'm talking about? This is the most annoying sound, and you had to bear with it. This is the emergency broadcasting system. In the case of a serious event, this will be used to, keep you aware of dangerous activities, right? Well, when 9/11 happened, the emergency broadcasting system didn't go off. So you can develop the best response plan, and it can just kind of go to pot. You have people running around, right, doing things based off of their own assumptions and their values. That's problematic, right? So there's conscious and there's subconscious. So there's the executive in your organization, and that's very important to understand because helping your executive understand the importance of this is just as important as getting in the door. The executive has a point of view that you can develop, okay? And we'll show you some ways you can do that at the subconscious level. But if you look at the PowerPoints we've had so far, they're very informational. I should, look at a checklist. I should build the system with security in mind. So when we're building our products and services, we actually integrate the system, not after the fact. There's a lot of I shoulds, and they're all very, very important. But the problem is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's a saying by Peter Drucker, right? So no matter what you inform people of, they still tend to go to their default mode And it's even worse nowadays because people are so darn distracted. They're distracted. I mean, I was just, I hate to do it, but it's the attraction to go to your iPhone or your smartphone is overwhelming, okay? So then you can also help executives understand they should do it because. So that's a frame of reference. And what we've been learning right now is a strong because. And it's your job, once you take this information out, to translate it and customize the language for your executives, right? But here's the problem. Their habit of mind. Beneath it all, whatever you tell me, whatever I'm learning from you, I still have a habit of mind, right? And one of a person's habit of mind that becomes most destructive in this case is, it's not an emergency now, right? I haven't heard a lot about it. This is great. They're trying to sell me a product, but really, chances are it won't happen. But chances are it will happen, and chances are it will come internally. It will be a disgruntled employee, somebody with a gambling problem like you mentioned, right? So this is important. Now, how do you get to the habit of mind? Well, society instructs an executive's understanding of what's going on. Society says, well, there's standards in the NCIS. No, that was a TV show. But the thing that you were talking about, NIST, and all the acronyms, great. But there's far more when it comes to an executive. So if you throw acronyms at an executive, they're going to go, whoa. But if you translate it the way that Michael and Michael, the other Michael, have done translation on this, it helps. However, there's why you're doing it, right? So like your moral principles. You could decide not to do it. And that decision is, frankly, if you look at all the information and you believe what we're selling up here, it's a moral obligation, okay, to your employees who would like to keep their jobs, to your clients who may be processing money through you and their information can be stolen. So there's a moral obligation here. But how do you get people to do the right thing? So that's what this presentation is all about. And the way I believe the avenue in and what studies show is by targeting the cultural level, okay? And culture is defined as the subconscious expectations that drive behavior, but they're shared. So every organization has their own ethos, okay? So if you look at financial organizations, not surprisingly, like a Thrivent or a US Bank, the ethos is very conservative and protective and defensive. And every ethos that you have has its dangers. So if the ethos of a bank, for instance, is too restricted and conservative, it may also be mistaken as a retaliatory culture. I think the first Michael was talking about how you have to create a culture where people feel comfortable that they won't be retaliated against when they ask specific questions. All right, so how do you get into that? Well, you could do explicit motivation, carrot and stick type motivation. You could reward employees when they do the right thing, right? They report a phishing email or something that was fishy or a USB drive that was left in a computer, and whose USB is that, right? You can reward them, and you can punish them when they fail to report something or they click on the wrong link. But this is just, I call it Google psychology. This is psychology that people who haven't actually studied psychology and understand behavioral science, they'll Google it. What can I do? And they might find some of the information online, but that's why frameworks like you had with the hub and spokes are so important. Human behavior, right? Reward and punishment. How many of you are parents? Okay, yeah. So reward and punishment works really well in the short term. Really well. But in the long term, in terms of sustaining behavior and keeping that retention rate strong, it works miserably. Miserably. So how do you motivate behavior in a sustainable way? So here's a way of looking at it. If you continue with the iceberg model. The point of view is, I should do this or else, right? I'll be punished or something will happen. So I'm informed by compliance. So all of the check boxes that we've been looking at inform that, right? That's what compliance is. You're compelled to comply or else. So these come up in the forms of, regulations, rewards, and punishments. frame of reference comes from society. It's because society requires something. So this is where all these associations come up and the reason why they exist. So this is manifest in organizations through organizational codes. If you work in healthcare, there's a patient bill of rights. That's very related to the last presentation, where people have, heart monitors or even unicorns who are transmitting data, right? And this comes in the form of codes, values, etc. So, explicit motivation. We can explicitly work and show what an executive should do after a breach. We can, and this is just, I Googled it. A lot of it you've already heard, right? Having a response plan, a crisis management point of contact, provide details about why it happened. This is the emergency broadcasting system, right? So what I'm talking about is more of a deeper way of getting people to do the right thing and be proactive. That was a word that came up a lot in these presentations. Having them be more proactive. This comes to the reputation and publicity point that was made over and over. 56% of US consumers stop buying from companies they believe are unethical. Okay? Now this is important because we're taking a proactive view at developing ethical organizations before the breach ever takes place, right? And managing your reputation. 29% of consumers take their social media, they take to social media to share their support of ethical companies. So how many of you remember the Tylenol scare? Okay, good. What did Tylenol do? What happened? Who could describe that scare? It's pretty. Well, yeah, that's what they actually did. But what did they do publicly? There was a scare. There was a poison, something that was actually hurting people who took the Tylenol, who thought it was helping them. But Tylenol did what when they found out? They immediately went to the shelves, and I mean immediately, of every store, and they took it off the shelves. And guess what? It actually worked in Tylenol's favor. It made consumers trust them even more. They didn't waver, they didn't stumble, they acted immediately, okay? There's a similar psychology where doctors are, despite lawsuits and the, litigious society we live in, those doctors who apologize more to patients after they make a mistake are less likely to have a lawsuit lobbed against them because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, right? But think about it. When you make a mistake, what's the first thing that you do internally? Uh-oh, right? But what do? What's like your mode of behavior? What do you go into? Like you become a child, right? It's like, oh my God, I did something, and mom and dad are gonna find out about it. And then what do? You try to preserve yourself. How do I rationalize this? How do I tell a story where it's actually not truly my fault? Executives do this all the time after breaches, right? They push it down. The best executives who really want to manage their reputation after a breach take sole responsibility for it, okay? That's true leadership. So data is not the only thing that's exposed after a breach, okay? This is kind of tiny lettering, but the ethos of your organization is on full display, and that's actually even more important in some cases than the data that's lost. Though it's not required to speak from the heart in these situations after a breach, this is an opportunity for clients and employees, so we're going to go there next, to connect more deeply with your organization. Integrity begets loyalty. You act with integrity. I know if I work for a boss who is kind of a terrible manager, but they have integrity oozing out of it, I will do anything for them. I will overlook the bad management qualities, and I will work my butt off for them because I've had more not so thoughtful bosses than I have had thoughtful ones. Does that resonate with you? Okay. So here's how it works underneath the surface. Now, I use the iceberg because the greatest mass of any iceberg is actually under the water, and that's what propels an iceberg. It's not the stuff that you see up top, like the checklists. It's the ethos, it's the attitudes, it's the way that employees show up, it's the way that they relate in what is called a socio-technical system. Organizations are socio-technical systems. So first there's a habit of mind. Beneath it all. So this is fantastic right here, right? A study, and it might surprise you. A study from risk management firm Friedberg found that just 45% of senior leaders believe they're responsible for protecting their company from breaches. Whoa. Talk about displacement of responsibility, right? All right. Now, you can actually measure in an organization the psychological risk that somebody will pawn off responsibility on someone else, which is a really bad sign. That's a really, really bad sign. Because cybersecurity is just one element of a poison pill that can occur in organizational culture. Ethos cuts across everything, strategy, policy, and you can measure it. You can ask, there's something called a moral disengagement scale, okay? This would be great for employees. You can ask questions on a Likert scale, 1 to 5. How much do you agree with the following statement? And this survey, I think, is about 30 questions. But here are two. I'm going to use an example here. You can say, stealing some money is not too serious compared to those who steal a lot of money. It's called advantageous comparison, right? I downloaded software, but it wasn't like, Bitcoin. I just downloaded a Dropbox file, right? I'm just sort of relating here. Employees are not at fault if their boss puts too much pressure on them to perform their work, right? So that's displacement of responsibility. This stuff lives in all of us since we were little, right? We could probably think of the first time that we got in serious trouble with our parents. I had two sisters. Allison did it. I didn't do it. It was her fault, right? Well, if only you were a better parent. Like that was fun. Okay. Now I have kids and I'm paying the price. Ethos. So ethos includes the shared expectations that actually drive behavior. And you might find after diagnosing in your organization that two really big forms of moral disengagement are taking place, right? So you might find out that these two out of an entire set are really key. Now what you do is you approach training differently. Instead of giving them a binder, you address these two areas full force. And you use a form of learning called transformative learning, which instead of giving people information, you're challenging people's assumptions about responsibility, and you're making it real for them. You use simulations. Our center uses virtual reality simulations, right? So this is something on the forefront of training in a transformative fashion. Because after all, if we really want the behavior, we've got to go after it in the right way. We don't want a checkbox that says, yeah, we trained our employees. That's helpful. It's kind of a CYA sort of deal. But if you really want to exact change, this is the level you go after. IBM estimates that 60% of all attacks are from the inside. And I don't even know how old this data is, but everybody has different statistics. But this is problematic, right? So people inside, whether it's by mistake or they're compelled. I used to work at Temple University. I was a professor over there about, 10 years ago now. And I heard a story. Now, this is interesting. I thought this is the way you do it. We had a cybersecurity person come in, and they told us a story about how a professor was teaching a class, right? So up there teaching, and after class, they left the podium, which is connected to the internet and the system, and I have to log in and all that deal. Well, they forgot to log out, and they left. And somebody came in with a little USB and just plugged it in and walked away. And here's what happened. They were able to hack into the grading system through the employee's connection to the system. I don't know how else to explain it. There's probably a technical way to say it. And they changed their grades. They pulled a Ferris Bueller and they changed their grades, right? And this was only found out way after the fact. So awareness, just training in awareness is key. But how do you actually change that? Well, okay, so we're saying if we come back to the idea that people are the new software of cybersecurity, well, what type of coding do you need to do? What type of patches do you require? Am I using these metaphors correctly? Okay. Cybersecurity is not like my first thing. I get all this from like TV, and so I apologize if I use the wrong word. 3 forms of code, okay? The first is developing principled leaders. This is really important. It's very tiny, so I'm just going to tell you in a nutshell what that means. That means providing transformative developmental opportunities for leaders, both senior and emerging, that humble them, that give them a competency of where in the moment they're challenged with a breach or any other unethical behavior, they're able to rise above their ego in order to benefit the welfare of everyone, right? Instead of saying, my sister did it, or all of these other immoral activities and orientations. So you could develop that across the organization. And the beautiful part is, when you do that, it not only prevents bad behaviors, it's good for business. Humanity is good for business, people. It's not exclusive from business. You could be both an ethical organization to work for and prosperous, and the two are correlated. All those bullet points, that's all based on research where if I put the parenthetical citation, it would just look like a monster slide, so I left that out. But the center that I lead takes advantage of this, and we make it real for organizations, okay? And we go in and we diagnose these things, and we talk about the benefits that would be particularly important to the organization. Now, there are some organizations who are way ahead on this. They already get it. Google gets it. Facebook, actually mostly technology firms. But there's a Goldman Sachs who gets it, believe it or not, right? IBM gets it. So, principled leadership, that's number one code. Second coding software for people, organizational citizenship. That's getting people to do the right thing, even when they're not rewarded or formally recognized for doing the right thing. It's like, you know, what you learn when you watch Mr. Rogers, but you forgot somewhere along the line. You do the right thing, even when it's not in your job description. And this is particularly important for those of you who either work in hierarchies, like the government or anything that's educationally related, right? Or you serve those hierarchies. There's a cultural mentality called work to rule. Does anybody know what that mentality means? It's not in my job description mentality. It's above my pay grade mentality, right? I don't know what to do with this phishing email I got. This is like IT takes care of that. I'm just going to delete it. I'm not going to report it, right? So that's super important to understand. So organizational citizenship is the antidote to that. You can develop that, and it's good for business. And last but not least, meaningful work. Now, by 2025, these things called millennials, talk about needing to recode your software in an organization. How many of you work with millennials? Right. That's going to go way up because by 2025, approximately 80% of the workforce is going to be comprised of millennials. And it's a good thing, and it's going to be a challenging thing. I call millennials the next bubble that's waiting to burst. Okay? And here's why. And it's actually very sweet. It's a sweet thing. Millennials are very interested in meaningful work. More interested than money or fame or prestige, although those are like, you know, those are mitigating motivational factors. But if you look broad brush at the research that's been done on millennials, you know, there was one research that came out about MBA students who graduated from Ivy League schools all over the country, and also second-tier schools, and asked them, you know, if you had a choice between an organization where you made a ton of money or you had a 30% cut in pay to work for an organization that felt like you were working for a cause or there was meaning available, where would you go? And 90%, it was like this huge figure, and I don't have it exactly, chose to go to the organization where meaningful work was available. Now, quick question. How on earth would meaningful work affect cybersecurity? Who can tie that together?
They're more likely to be the responsible citizens who might report a breach.
Ownership. Think about it like this. Totally, you nailed it. Think about it like this. When you're an employee, there's always a degree to which you feel like, you know what, I feel responsible for this organization. I'm going to pick up the paper when I see it thrown in the corner. I'm going to talk to people. I'm going to get out there. I'm not just going to focus on my job. And then there's a degree to where you feel like, you know what, I'm only trying out this organization. I'm sort of renting it. We'll see how it goes. It's an interesting neighborhood, but they're not fully invested in the organization, and they're much less likely, as you put it, to demonstrate those organizational citizenship behaviors. So there are ways of creating meaningful work. Now, what I'm going to show you is a little bit of an overlay. How do you apologize after a breach? Well, here's how a principled leader would apologize after a breach. This comes from it's called ethical intelligence. First, they take responsibility for it immediately. Tylenol, right? Just remember Tylenol. Now, if you look at the data, I only started looking at things like Equifax and Sony PlayStation and Yahoo and the SEC. They're all notorious for having terrible response times, like really bad response times. In Europe, I think you're compelled by law to respond within 72 hours of a breach. The SEC, I think, took 2 weeks to respond. Why is that? It's human nature. We go into self-preservation mode. That's what people do, right? So you take responsibility immediately. You apologize to the very first person that you've wronged. You speak from the heart. You convey a concrete strategy. You know that a meaningful apology with integrity is not a weakness. In fact, it can actually work in your advantage. And I'm not talking about let a breach happen and then you apologize with integrity so that your publicity is good. But it is a good thing. And you need to think about these things. All right? And don't be afraid to ask for help. All of those things that are recommended for an executive to do after a breach come from the same source, which is the ability to rise above ego. And it's really hard. There's a hidden curriculum in business that motivates people to do the opposite. Okay? Organizational citizenship. Key here, don't flood employees with information after the fact or even before the fact. Information overload kills people. They're already distracted. Business is very ambiguous and complex. You throw more information at them, and human beings do something called satisfice. Does anybody know what that is? This is a really important trait of human beings. They can't take in a lot of information. Max, 2 or 3 points you'll remember when you leave here today. And maybe one of those points is knowing where to look for information in the packets or the website after you leave. That's probably the most important one. Where do I go? But keep it simple, right? Don't flood your employees. They're likely not to remember anything. Instead, what you do is you use teachable moments, like that Temple University study I talked about, or the incident. That's just stayed with me. An after-action review, all right? So you focus also not just on the process, but the why, the premise behind the process. Why do we speak immediately? Does this all kind of resonate with you guys? Right? It's just being human is what it's all about. And lastly, meaningful work. This is probably my favorite slide because there is somebody from the University of St. Thomas ITS group here today. I'm not going to look at, but I've been looking at the whole time. I have a great relationship with the ITS group here, a really great relationship. They've taken inordinate measures and steps to get out and infiltrate the human beings who work at the University of St. Thomas. They're like bots, I'm just kidding. But they get out there, right? Because they have kind of a bad reputation that they have to battle. One is they're the web police. I want to download Dropbox. I got to submit a ticket. And the ticket disappears for a week or so, and then it turns around, and it's in this really condensed little thing. I need a magnifying glass to read it. I'm not sure who it's to. It's in color. There's lots of information. And then finally, I learned that I can install it, but I need somebody there, and I got to schedule an appointment. So getting people in IT out to actually meet, right, and be proactive and have open hours goes a long way. So building those relationships between IT and the rest of the employees is a really great preventative measure. Now, I work for this place called the Center for Ethical Organizations. And our goal really there is to hit that subconscious level. We call it humanity, we call it human behavior. It is the most important facet of business today, and as you've learned, it's exceptionally important to cybersecurity and doing the right thing. I handed out a bunch of brochures, and you could read through that at your leisure. But I just wanted to share what we have and what we offer. We're a 501c3 that works in affiliation with the College of Business, another great entity to look into, that believes in principled leadership, the ability to rise above ego, create a space where you can actually serve the common good. That's our St. Thomas language, but you get it, right? But we help people do it. We provide those transformative opportunities that get at the gut level. We provide ways of diagnosing it in an organization to determine what's actually working and what the risk is that somebody might displace responsibility or do that thing called, you guys going to remember this after you leave? Advantageous comparison, right? Doesn't matter if I steal paper. There's that guy over there, getting all kinds of money, embezzling all kinds of money. We have a member portal where if you become a member, you get access to all of these goodies. And me. And I'm happy to help. I hope that you'll find ways to integrate ethics training in your services if you're a service provider, so that you're not just providing the technical system or information about what employees should do or a checkbox, but actually addressing the socio-technical system. Cybersecurity requires human involvement. You can never get around that fact. If you'd like to check us out, we're at ethicalorganizations.org. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you have a key takeaway that you can bring back today. Thanks.